Hi, my name is Juliana. I'm going to do a brainstorming session on an article written by Buckley, published in 1968. The article is Society as a Complex Adaptive System, but it's important for anybody who happens to listen to this that this is a brainstorming session, so I'm not feeling particularly pressured to be correct or make a lot of sense. If you have certain things to debate, you can use the comment section here. But this is supposed to be used for my own research in the writing of my thesis. This helps me to organize my thought process and so on. So that that being said, that being on the table, please do not feel like I need to make a lot of do not take me so seriously in my comments here. But I hope this could eventually serve as a place, a venue for furthering the debate on this topic. This is a topic that I find completely amusing, amazing, interesting. There is a lot that was said about social systems, societies as a complex system, particularly through the 20th century. I'm thinking that the social sciences might be picking up on this, especially because of artificial intelligence. So, artificial intelligence now is regaining like the community of developers, of scientists in AI is regaining interest in the concept of self-organization, self-regulation, and so on. So I think that because the social sciences are so tuned up to what is happening in artificial intelligence, in the development of autonomous systems and so on, then I think that the social science might be picking up on this topic. And it's great that there was so much that was written about it in the 20th century. But it felt that between, the 90s and the early 2000s, particularly, I wouldn't say the 90s so much, because we had Niklas Luhmann, who published a theory of society, and that was entirely based on systems theory. But through the 2000s, 2010s, there was a lot of network thinking in the social sciences because of the STS community, STS scholars, which means science and technology studies. But what that helped with was that I think that it's a movement that sort of started in the 80s, but particularly with the publication of Andrew Pickering in 1993, The Mangle of Practice, the social sciences started bringing other elements other than humans into the social interaction, into the social process. And I think that was definitely a shift in social thinking and the sociological thinking. And this is something that Buckley also points to, that there was this sort of shift, two shifts, one, that the sociology changed from looking at society in terms of analyzing its structures, so institutions, groups, and so on, to analyzing social processes. And then within that, what makes the complexity theory particularly viable for the study of societies is exactly the sort of uh, um, embracing of non-human agency in the social interaction. I'm sorry, in the social process. So Buckley will start by saying that, well, first, that this article has been argued um, with more depth in his work from 1967. The name of the book is Sociology and Modern Systems Theory. But then this article in 1968 is in a book that's called Modern Systems Research for the Behavioral Scientist. It's a source book edited by Buckley that contains several other articles within the scope of systems theory and social research. So he will explain a lot about this shift from looking at structures to looking at process. So he mentions, how that began in Durkheim, and the turn from the 19th to the 20th century. You had that movement shifting to analysis of social processes. And what that helps us understand is that society is not a it cannot be seen as a sort of equilibrium system, but as an adaptive system, because the structures, they are not permanent. So self-regulate up until the 60s, of course, we have a lot of the understanding of cybernetics in sociological dynamics. I think that this was called social cybernetics, that helped understand yes, mechanisms of regulation, of self-regulation. But according to Buckley, this will only lead to a permanent balanced structure, because once you're in equilibrium, you're stable, but that doesn't stay stable for long. It has a limited this a stabilized system is a limited condition that eventually the environment changes, and then the system has to adapt to that environment. And in order to adapt to the environment, adaptation implies that a change in the structure needs to happen. So looking at social systems as complex adaptive systems instead of looking at them as just homeostatic equilibrium systems, as with the notion of cybernetics, is going to give us this this scope of change in the structure. And so his proposal is really an analytical framework for studying social technical systems. And this analytical framework needs to apply relational logic as the tool of analysis. So the shift from structure to process means that we're going to be looking at the elements contained within that social system that we're trying to analyze, and trying to look at the way in which components interact amongst themselves. So he does differentiate the internal feedbacks. So this interaction between elements of the system is analyzed through understanding how information flows in the system. That you could see information exchange between the elements of the system, and how this exchange establishes feedback loops. And these feedback loops are both established in the internal mechanism of the system, but then because of the system is always embedded in a larger context, then the system also establishes feedback mechanisms with its environments, with whatever it is present in the environment. And as you go not up, because that's like a hierarchical order, but as the system increases in complexity, it also increases the levels, like a higher level complexity means that you have a higher level system composed of subsystems. So the system is always embedded in this sort of higher level order of complexity. And then feedback loops are established both internally and then with the external environment. So how, for you to analyze the system in a particular environment, you just analyze how it relates to its environmental reality. What I explained here, he calls this as a topology of systems. And he says that, well, the sort of going from lower level complexity to higher orders of complexity is a continuum of evolving levels of systemic levels. And this he calls the topology of systems. So for us to understand why social technical systems are being considered by Buckley and by within within the field of systems thinking as a complex adaptive system, is because complexity evolves from lower biological levels to higher social cultural levels, and as it evolves in terms of complexity, then the linkages, the communication linkages, right, how information flows, become a bit more, let's say, he gives like an order, a degree of freedom to the elements of the system, but it's, in my understanding, it just depends on, yeah, where you stand in the, yeah, in scheme of reality, like in the microcosmos or macrocosmos and so on. So how much of the system you can observe. So for us, a cellular environment, like a biological cell, individual cell within its cellular environment, it's something very tiny, it's very compact. Everything is sitting there, and we can sort of measure that. But because we stand at a very high level of complexity, much more complex than cellular environments, then we cannot perceive, all of the elements of the system. So we perceive this as a, well, as Buckley puts it, like a degree of freedom of elements. But if you're sitting inside as like a tiny molecule within a biological cellular environment, yeah, you're sort of observing the same dimension of space and so on. But this is a bit of a deep thought and an observation that he made in terms of degrees of freedom. I think it might be a bit irrelevant in the context of my thesis, but of course it's still interesting to discuss. So how does this structure come to take form from the interactions of the elements in the lower levels of complexity? And that comes because of the interaction of the elements creates like frictions, and from that interactive dynamics, then the physical changes, the structural changes happen. And to him, structure is only a relative stability of underlying ongoing microprocesses. So the processes will create structure, but the structure will also be, a temporal stability. It won't stay stable for too long, right? So, quoting him here, interactive relationships become relatively and temporarily stabilized into social and cultural structures. I would say here technological structures, because, yeah, this is the context that we're looking at social technical systems within, the 21st century now. So with this dynamics of like lower level interactions and then the structural forms that are adaptive in the higher levels of complexity, this dynamics that he explained becomes a sort of continuous, and this is his words, morphogenic processes, which is these morphogenic processes are the development of a structure, their maintenance and their change that happens through the interaction. And a lot of the social sciences has already been arguing, in particular in the STS scholars. They've been arguing this and terming this as like a constant becoming of things. Like, so the body is constantly becoming, things. Reality is a constant becoming. It's not something that's static. This is, this is where it comes, probably where it comes from. So for us to analyze these processes of information flows, communication is of central importance. This is something that Niklas Luhmann pointed to in his work of social systems, and a theory of society, where he uses complexity to analyze social systems. In communication and cognitive processes, because as he explains here, systems, they will create this sort of mapping of the environment, and it will carry on that information. And I think that he is referring here to genetics. but that the systems, it's important for systems to map the environment so that it knows how to behave, because the system elements and components of the system will respond to conditions within its environment. So the mapping is essential. I mean, the mapping is an essential part of, yeah, how the system behaves. Yeah, it's based on the mapping of the environment. And he uses the term organizational behavior as the sort of response, collective response. Yeah, so the system's response to the information it receives from the environment. So after all, I think it's a highly recommended article for anybody interested in the study of social technical systems as, the sort of complex mechanism. I took a lot of notes. This is highly relevant to my research. I will go back to it many times, but I don't think that, maybe for the time it was published, even today, this is highly relevant, because not a lot of social scientists are speaking of of society as a complex adaptive system. But for those who are already familiar with the topic of complexity, yeah, he doesn't add too much. He just sort of, yeah, reinforces the idea that you can do sociology by looking at complex adaptive system and complexity theory and systems theory and so on. So very important. I super recommend. Yeah, and hopefully I will go over his book as well and then do another brainstorming session on that as well. Thank you for listening. Comments, debates and so on. Read the text, come back. Yeah, discuss with me. That would be super interesting.